Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick Dubois, and coming up on the show...
The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom rules the Rwanda scheme unlawful, upending a key part of the government's plan to deal with migrant arrivals.
Are you getting sacked for telling the truth, Home Secretary?
It comes days after the Prime Minister sacked the architect of the plan, Suella Braverman. She's accused him of betraying the nation. It could be a dangerous moment for the Prime Minister, who says he will change the law to get the policy through. Tory party unity is under threat once again after the government's flagship Rwanda scheme was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court. That's because the East African nation deports nearly all asylum seekers from Syria and Afghanistan to their home countries. Despite this, Sunak says he will push ahead with the scheme, disapplying parts of domestic law and agreeing a new treaty with Rwanda to ensure refugees are not returned to their home country.
We have prepared for all outcomes of this case. And so we have been working on a new international treaty with Rwanda. This will provide a guarantee in law that those who are relocated from the UK to Rwanda will be protected against removal from Rwanda.
Tensions in the Tory party were already running high before this latest setback, and the new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, may have inflamed them further with his comments to the House of Commons.
I will inform the House we are not going to put forward proposals simply to manufacture an unnecessary row for political gain. We have a plan.
He was, of course, referring to his predecessor, Suella Braverman. She was sacked earlier in the week after comments about the policing of pro-Palestinian protests. In a letter to the Prime Minister, Braverman accused him of wishful thinking, betrayal and a failing to comply with a secret deal struck last year ahead of his appointment as leader of the Conservative Party. She concludes that your plan is not working. We have endured record election defeats. Your resets have failed and we are running out of time. You need to change course urgently. Sunak certainly has changed course, although the public is split on whether it's for the better. He's brought in former Prime Minister David Cameron as Foreign Minister in what is likely to be a final reshuffle ahead of a general election. That's not a particularly popular decision, according to Ipsos Mori. Almost half those polled think his appointment was the wrong decision, compared to just 1 in 3 who support it. His decision to sack Suella is proving far more popular. An overwhelming majority, 70%, agree, compared with 17% who disagree. Here with me in the studio are Stuart Jackson, former UK Special Advisor, former Member of Parliament for Peterborough and now a Member of the House of Lords, Bob Neal, Conservative MP and the Chair of Parliament's Justice Select Committee, and Madeleine Grant, Telegraph columnist and parliamentary sketchwriter. Welcome to you all. Madeleine, perhaps I could just start with you, and I'm just going to read this out. Uncertain, weak and lacking in the qualities of leadership that this country needs, so said the former Home Secretary, of course, in her verdict on the Prime Minister. She said he has to change course. He has, I suppose, changed course with the appointment of his cabinet, but does it really matter now what he does? Are the Conservative Party beyond the redemption and ability to unite?
Well, I think that the Conservative Party are so in the doldrums now, and having been through so many leaders in such a short space of time, that in some ways that kind of, in a way, cements Sunak's position a bit. You know, it would be utterly ridiculous for there to be, you know, any kind of contendership for the next contest over the next leadership. And so far, the number of MPs who've actually broken ranks to criticise him publicly is quite small. You know, it's probably in the single digits. Andrea Jenkins, and you have Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates of the New Conservatives have both accused him of jettisoning the 2019 coalition that brought the general election victory in that year. But I think there is generally a real sense of low morale And I think the biggest story is probably not so much MPs who are directly criticising the Prime Minister, but more the number who are coming out and saying that they plan not to run again, that they're stepping down from politics. This is the kind of, I think, the more terminal problem for the party than the internal divisions.
So there's a lack of morale, but Stuart Jackson, just some headlines. They're very... I'll spare the agony a little bit. The Express, war is declared. The Daily Mail, we had a deal and you broke it, according to Suella with Rishi Sunak. The Times, the PM lied to me. And more recently, she's put down her 5 tests of how to deal with the Rwanda problem. Was Michael Howard right to say, I think Suella Braverman will be forgotten? Or is the truth she's now declared war on Rishi Sunak and it's become all very John Major in the dying years of his administration for the Conservatives?
Well, I think Michael Howard was wrong to intervene in that way, and it wasn't very helpful. I think sometimes you've got to conclude that, as Jim Callaghan once said, once the tide of history turns, there's really nothing you can do. And often administrations just run out of luck. And I think Rishi Sunak was lucky to get the premiership without winning a popular mandate or a party mandate. But he seems to have run out of luck. And the fact of the matter is, all elections are about hope versus fear. And the fear of not getting Brexit and the fear of Jeremy Corbyn are now gone. So you have to have hope. And frankly, recycling people from 6-7 years ago, such as David Cameron, it doesn't speak to a party which has got a very confident, visionary, forward-looking prospectus. And I think that's his problem, that he seems to have alienated the Red Wall voters who are basically saying, well, what about your sensible policies on net zero, etc., but not really engage the voters. The polling, in fact, has got worse since the reshuffle. So I think he really is in a very, very difficult position.
Bob, 19% was the lowest recording voting polling figure for the Conservatives I can remember. Madeleine said morale's at an all-time low. It does seem that quietly in the reshuffle only of a few days ago, that actually Conservative MPs are voluntarily giving up their jobs, perhaps looking for jobs outside. Is morale that bad? And is that the root of the problem?
I don't think it is that bad, actually, with respect to Madeleine. It's not great, of course, because we've been through a difficult time. But where there are difficulties, I think if there are some people who are pretty fed up with the situation in the Commons, not as many, I think, as is sometimes thought, and if the polling is low, that's not the fault of the Prime Minister. It's the inheritance he had from the chaos of the earlier part of last year. I think the Prime Minister himself, in my constituency, when I'm talking to real voters, we've got a by-election on in my patch at the moment, and I've been out on the doorsteps there. Of course people have got real concerns, don't dispute that for 1 second. But they actually think, yeah, he's a sensible guy, he's intelligent, he's being stable, he's getting on with it, he's got some tough challenges, so I am much more positive. And after all, just remember the other thing, the John Major thing that Stuart refers to, yeah, that was difficult, but that was up against Tony Blair. Keir Starmer's no Tony Blair. And everything ultimately, I think, will turn on the economy. Can we get the cost of living down? Can we actually get inflation down? We actually had good news on that, been halved, but rather lost in all the noises off.
But let me just put this to you, because I think Stuart's other point was Jim Callaghan said basically when there's a change in the tide, there's not a lot you can do about it. A focus group just during the Labour Party conference, after the last conference, which was the Labour Party conference, it asked the following questions. It said, who had the best conference? And people went, just like you're saying, Rishi Sunak. People then said, what party do you think sent the strongest message? Rishi Sunak. Who are you going to vote for? Keir Starmer. Why? Time for a change. You can't beat that, can you? That's what you're up against, and that's what Tony Blair actually got into power on, wasn't it?
I think the difference maybe is this. Tony Blair, A, was a far more effective communicator. B, I think time for a change is a perfectly understandable sentiment when you've been in power for a very long time. However, since then, we've seen Keir Starmer run into real problems within his own party, and he has managed to get to the stage of saying, I'm the change candidate, by not setting out at all what he really is for. And as we get nearer to the general election, which I think will be towards the end of the next year rather than sooner, then our job is to be really rigorous about scrutinising him, holding him up for what actually sits behind these policies, Because actually, there are some pretty divisive policies there, insofar as he's got any. He's got no answer, for example, around some of the migration issues, where we've been talking about that, but no answer from the Labour side on that. They've been hopelessly split on what's happening in the Middle East. And nowhere have they got, final point to examine, so nowhere have they got a scheme properly to pay for all these spending pledges. Now, that's the sort of stuff we've got as Conservatives to hammer home.
I agree with Bob on the Labour Party. Of course, they're not ready for power and they don't have a full suite of popular policies. They don't have what they call political retail to sell to the voters. I've got to come back on the point Bob made about, well, it's not Rishi's fault, it's the inheritance. That doesn't really stack up historically. If you look at 1992, the Tories won after a very difficult period with the poll tax and getting rid of Margaret Thatcher, when they were miles behind in the polls and losing by-elections. And Boris, in 2019, delivered the best result in 30 years after the terrible Brexit civil war between 2016 and 2019. So the idea that it's all Liz Truss's fault or Boris's fault, I mean, to be fair, Rishi's been in power now for 13 months. And if he were able to put forward an attractive, positive narrative and get those 5 pledges sorted, he probably would be doing better in the polls. To be honest, I thought he'd be 10, 15% behind now and then claw back. But it's looking very, very difficult at the moment.
I think, in fairness, again, back to this point, there is a big difference. There was the one change when Margaret left and John Major took over, and that was painful for the party. But I think what we didn't have was the circumstances. The circumstances of the departure, sadly, of Boris, who did much good work, but unfortunately...
But you got rid of him.
In the end. And he did. And frankly...
Boris did quite a lot to get rid of himself.
Boris got rid of himself, basically. And then you had the very unconservative approach of Liz, of someone saying, look, I want to cut taxes. Well, I'm in favour of cutting taxes, but I don't borrow money to do it. And I think that's what lost a lot of credibility.
And also a massive spending programme on top of that, the most money that any government had ever spent on anything.
It didn't add up.
All right, so you know, whether the legacy or not is, the Conservatives are in a pretty rotten place. This week, we started talking about David Cameron on the reshuffle, and then it swung right back to Suella Braverman and Rwanda. We know where we are now, that the Rwanda has been ruled illegal, the policy for migration, Madeleine. Actually, Rishi Sunak came out a bit punchy, but saying he's going to carry on with Rwanda. Is that just a tactic to appease the right and perhaps upset the left that he's still going on in his own party? And is it deliverable?
Well, this is the thing, because he was saying we will bring through emergency legislation. And obviously, I'm not an immigration lawyer and it's all very technical. But I can't help but think that if it was that simple, we would have already done it by now, right? I mean, this is not easy. You get hampered at every step of the way, whether it's from the legal system or whether it's coming from, I imagine emergency legislation would have to get through both the House of Commons and, more importantly, the Lords, where, it could be endlessly with new bits tacked on and the back and forth.
And it drags on.
It would drag on for a very long time. I mean, I think that he came across as very punchy, and I know that a lot of people within the Conservative Party were very pleased with what they heard. But I've yet to see evidence that is backed up with concrete action.
It's a bit of a cheek, isn't it, that Suella Braverman comes out and says, here's my 5 bits of the test to make sure you get Rwanda right. She's been Home Secretary for a while now. Why didn't she get it right?
Well, you've got collective cabinet responsibility, and she would make the point, I think, were she here, that she did write to Rishi Sunak when she took the post as Home Secretary, and that she had undertakings from him to do certain things. I mean, I'm not convinced there ever was a demonstrably practical plan B by him if the court case went against the government. What I would say is we're a dualist system in this country. We don't just cut and paste international treaties. The whole point of parliamentary sovereignty and democracy is that we incorporate that into domestic law, as Bob, as a very eminent lawyer and MP, knows. And it's very corrosive of the faith and trust people have in politics and government if they see the court striking down a policy which has been arrived at by an elected parliament. And I'm not saying the Supreme Court should be disregarded, but certainly there's a case...
Are they to be blamed? Because surely it's the politicians should have got it right in the first place.
What worries me is that I think £140 million has already been spent on the programme, which worries me greatly. But I do think the bigger issue is the British people have voted to control illegal or irregular immigration, and they see very simply that the court is blocking it and that nothing's happening and government and politics is not able to address their issues.
Well, hang on. This sounds like, Madeleine, that we're hearing the secret plan of Rishi Sunak, I've no idea how close you are to him, I'm not sure, is let's have a general election, us or the courts. Who do you back? Echoes of Boris Johnson, Parliament or the establishment. Is that really where we could end up here? Is that the secret plan?
It's kind of hard to picture Rishi Sunak as being the person leading that charge. That kind of sort of anti-establishment feeling fervour has never, even though he is a passionate Brexiteer, he doesn't always feel like one in the same way that sort of Boris was quite good at projecting that. I mean, the thing about this case is that it's our own Supreme Court, so, you know, if I'm not sure that going after the ECHR would necessarily solve these problems. I mean, a lot of the problem, the way I see it, goes back to very long-standing refugee legislation. You know, the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. You know, that was drafted at a time when the world was dramatically different in terms of population flows. And we're now in a position where there's absolutely no way that Europe and prosperous Western countries could possibly sustain the number of people that would now be eligible to claim asylum there. And we're a much more globalised, interconnected world.
I was surprised Rishi Sunak dug in and said he's going to deliver Rwanda and just about said planes will leave before the general election. And that was kind of the code that we were all meant to read in it. You can't be happy that they're still digging into a policy that's not only cost a lot of money, that could pitch your government, your party, against the courts as well.
Well, I think it's worth bearing in mind that Rishi, as somebody whose family came to this country through the legal routes, feels, I think, very strongly, personally, that it's immoral to allow criminals to take advantage of people to come in through unlawful routes to the disadvantage of those who've played the game fair. I think he genuinely feels very personally, very strongly about that. I think the second point is, I personally would take the view that there is no single silver bullet in this. And Rwanda can be a part of it, potentially. The court, after all, found that the concept of dealing with people's applications in a third country is perfectly lawful.
But
that
as
wasn't
a lawyer,
the problem.
let me ask you as a lawyer, it's also clear in that judgment that no court is going to be convinced that whether you had a separate treaty or not that said do not send the people we send you back to their country of origin, you can't trust Rwanda. That was the implication of the court. Surely it's going to fail at that level.
Well, when you look at the court's decision, it's a very interesting phrase, which says that on the evidence presented to it, which is essentially evidence which was taken in about September 2021, when the proceedings were started, you couldn't trust that. The court very helpfully set out the specifics as to where they thought there were deficiencies in Rwanda's reliability, for want of a better word. And the court said it is possible that these could be rectified in the future. Now, how quickly that can be done, that is a question. I mean, I agree. I don't think Rishi's going to go for an us versus them election. I think it's very noteworthy that his tone and that of James Cleverly, the new Home Secretary, has been much more considered about this. It's absolutely right that we haven't had attacks on the courts, attacks on the judges, and as he's rightly said, it will be irrelevant anyway, because the ECHR has nothing to do with this. So, well, I thought actually Suella had some interesting suggestions as to practical things we could do on the ground in Rwanda to make that better, to make that more effective. So she then made the mistake of saying, "Oh, get out of the ECHR, get out of all the treaties." Well, that's not going to make any difference.
Well, Priti Patel also made similar points. He wrote an op-ed for us, and it seems like there are actually things that could have been done that weren't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, if you think about it, Stuart, you've been in Parliament 12 years, so you kind of know the Conservative Parliamentary Party very well, but can perhaps look outside with your perspective now. Inflation, he's doing all right on that. It's come down to 4.6%, whether you think it's anything to do with him or not. He can actually point, as the Home Secretary was saying in the House of Commons yesterday, that compared to Europeans, we're actually beginning to get immigration and illegal immigration under control. He's getting some successes now. So will the party think, oh, there's a chance, let's unite around his Rwanda effort? Do you think that could happen?
It could happen. I think the difficulty he's had this week with the reshuffle is that a lot of Red Wall MPs feel that they've had a bit of a slap in the chops, frankly, that they're going back to a sort of blue wall, home counties, comfort zone, of the good old days of William Hague, David Cameron and George Osborne, and it's like a bad dream, you know, the red wall. What's that? I mean that may be
that's
unfair.
Fundamentally because of David Cameron's appointment.
Well,
you think?
you know, Bob is a long-standing member of Parliament. If your message is that you have not got anyone of the 349 people who take the Tory whip to serve as Foreign Secretary, and you have to bring back someone who left in high dudgeon, let's remember, who said he would stay as an MP and Prime Minister and didn't 7 years ago, then they're going to be rather aggrieved. And I do think that it's a cultural issue here. And as regards the... I want the Conservative Party to win the election. I think Labour government would be a catastrophe for this country. But the problem is that sometimes the economy doesn't help you. Look at 93 to 97. The electorate stored up their animosity, and I was a candidate in that election. I only lost by 19,000 in my seat. Right? You know, it sometimes doesn't matter. And I go back to the point about, you know, when the tide has changed, and people are sadly now saying, look, the Tories, you've had 14 years, it's time to move on.
Just pick up on it. I understand that, Stuart, and yeah, that is a challenge for us. I'm going to say, I take a different view about Cameron. Sometimes you actually want to bring in people. We sometimes take the view that you never bring back people with experience. I think that's a mistake, actually, and particularly in the Foreign Office.
Labour do it too.
Labour do it, yeah, absolutely. There's nothing unusual in it, actually. Cameron has a huge experience in the international field, and in particular as Foreign Secretary, the contacts and that length of corporate knowledge is really valuable. You might not do that in a domestic post, but I think you can as Foreign Secretary, first point. And secondly, worth remembering, Cameron, as leader of the party, actually got us one of the biggest swings ever to get us into government in 2010, then got us an overall majority in 2015 when nobody thought we could.
The point?
And he did that, final point.
He also won 2 out of 3 referendums.
Absolutely. He won most of the things.
Yeah, he lost the big one. But
of course, he did that by not forgetting those blue war seats.
Well, this is the point. Have they switched, Madeleine, from a strategy of red wall to now that they actually what they want to do is to rebuild the coalition Cameron had in 2015?
Well, that is kind of very much how it looks. The optics of it are one thing, and you know, it remains to be seen in terms of policies what they do next. I think it's very much up for debate. Certainly, a lot of red wall MPs feel very aggrieved about the direction that they're going in, as Stuart was saying. But the interesting thing with David Cameron is that of all the jobs for him to have, I appreciate that Foreign Secretary is a very different job. They're often abroad. We often don't see them in action. You know, we see pictures of them.
But that might suit Rishi Sunak.
Yes, well, yes. But I almost wonder if he's partly there as a sort of mentoring figure to support Rishi Sunak. You know, someone who does actually have a track record. But it's an interesting appointment because I would say of all Cameron's legacies, I think he did a lot of very good things. He was interested in reforming the state in a way that, you know, very few prime ministers have been brave enough to do. However, I think on foreign policy, it was an absolute disaster. You know, the Libyan intervention helped turn Libya into a failed state, through which now many, I think a majority of the Channel migrants that make their way to Europe are now passing through Libya.
All right, Madeleine's made a really good point there, and yet he won't answer to the Commons. He's going to be answering to people like you and the Lords. No. How does that work?
Well, first of all, can I come back to Libya and Syria? I actually supported him on that, and I think in many respects he was absolutely ahead of his time and right. He can't be responsible for history since. He isn't answerable. Andrew Mitchell, who's a very experienced minister, as Minister of State, will answer in the Commons for him. Just the bigger picture is, if this reshuffle results in an absolute sea change in Conservative thinking on a number of areas, on reform of social care, on reform of the NHS, on embedding the academies programme, on cutting taxes, cutting regulation, cutting immigration, the party has a chance of at least preventing a big Labour win, maybe even winning, or being the largest party. But if it doesn't do that, steady as she goes, I mean, let's be honest, cancelling HS2, legislating on smoking and something about T-levels is not what they're talking about.
Doesn't excite you, does it?
Well, they're not talking about it in the Dog and Duck in Scunthorpe. It's not going to shift the dial, as the politicos say. There has to be something big. There has to be a narrative, and it's what I said earlier. It's hope versus fear. We need some hope as Conservative supporters. And to be honest with you, you cannot disregard your core vote, because even in 97 we got 32% of the vote. And if you write off the core vote, you're heading for a catastrophic defeat. And the final thing I would say is Canada in 1993, you had a populist party breaking away called the Reform Party. the Canadian Conservatives ended up in that general election with 2 seats in the House of Commons. And that may very well happen in this time. We're not in a deferential world anymore. Yeah. People are very transactional in who they vote for.
Are people listening, though, to the Conservatives?
I think that there is a very small window in which they can still make that case, but people are increasingly switching off. I barely know anyone, and I move, although I'm, in my early 30s, I do have young people who are Conservative-minded, and a lot of these people who completely agree with everything that the Conservative Party normally stands for are saying, I might vote for Keir.
Which, if I may just bring it to a close, that is precisely the challenge facing the Conservatives at the next election. So I'm very grateful for your time, Madeleine Grant, Lord Jackson, and, of course, Sir Bob Neal. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here. And thank you for joining me. And don't forget to check out TRT World on YouTube for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.